Kitchen the Magum Chiak. Kakanage when I go tapping minik negatic, emas negatic and go on the Mago and Skunagan Sigonanza. Ego kino and Kagan Mugumana Tapsco, Chugawis Aputok, Chugawip match Tokonas the Magon and Chugan Sutskategen. Kind of thick. Menukachas gets pisum. In a Menukin Stag Musks. Minamanukip Machok. Nippe. Gamin Jiminan when the Mago and Gikatu Nunga giza kitten stamen. Welcome on, my Canada. Taso jaga bez gon ho jisen sut stank. Angawa ni is seneguta sutamagon. Niganing. Kitte zabandam no giza tapso jonza megasang hoe kmine konan. Katan tanapons konagaitama. Kitte zabandam na fajenem sinyak. Ego gaun gigite pasnesimen tapso gwisaga chopskatamen. Ego kawan unjama met ninjagatasnon hoe. Jenny Penhiga, Kamoe mas notas Hagak Siamna.
According to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Crown acknowledged that the First Nations people had Aboriginal title to the land in what we now know as Canada. The Royal Proclamation confirmed the existence of Aboriginal title and proclaimed that First Nations could only surrender their Aboriginal title to the Crown. Since the Europeans first arrived in the New World, they brought their customs, language, and laws that would control the lives of First Nations people for centuries. Even today, the First Nations people are still bound by restrictive legislation that has its roots from the early 1800s. When Canada first became a colony of Great Britain in 1867, it soon became apparent to the federal government that in order to fulfill the national dream of creating a state that linked the east with the west coast, it would be necessary to extinguish the Aboriginal title from the First Nations in the prairie regions. The federal government's plan was to make treaties with the different linguistic groups of First Nations. In the eyes of the federal government, the treaties would serve three important aspects of asserting control. The first is to extinguish title from the First Nations to the land, and the second is to open up the West for settlement. The last aspect of the treaty-making process would geographically isolate the First Nations people onto reserves, in the hope that the nomadic lifestyle of hunting and gathering would be changed to that of a more settled agricultural lifestyle. Soon after, Manitoba became a province of Canada in 1870. The first of the numbered treaties would be signed between the First Nations and the Crown as represented by the federal government in 1871 at Lower Fort Garry. Treaty number 2 would also be signed later in 1871. Treaty number 3 would be signed in 1873, and Treaty number 4 would be signed in 1874. Although Treaties number 1 and 2 had the same amount of promised reserve land in the amount of 160 acres per family of 5, Treaties 3 and 4 had a much larger allotment of reserve land in the amount of 640 acres per family of 5. Treaty number 5 is different from the first 4 treaties because its history would begin in 1875 and end in 1910, which is a span of 35 years, and the amount of reserve land promised was 160 acres per family of 5. Treaty number 5 is different from the other numbered treaties because it originated in 2 historical phases. The southern part of the treaty was part of the Prairie Plan to open the West for settlement, It is clear that this region is not agricultural land, but was still an area that needed to be relinquished of Aboriginal title in order to allow free passage for non-natives in the area. The Crown responsibility of acquiring Aboriginal title from the First Nations was assigned to Alexander Morris. At this time, Alexander Morris's instructions were to secure title to all the land surrounding Lake Winnipeg. The government at this time felt that the land north of this region had no long-term economic benefit and was of little value. In the early 1900s, the Canadian government decided to construct a rail line to the shores of Hudson's Bay, which meant that land now became valuable and the First Nations would have to relinquish their title to the land by way of the treaty-making process. In 1908, the Inspector of Indian Agencies, John Semmons, set out to make an adhesion to Treaty No. 5 with the Northern First Nations. In 1910, Commissioner John Semmons concluded the treaty-making process in Manitoba by signing the last of the Northern First Nations into Treaty No. 5. All of the numbered treaties that were signed between the First Nations and the Crown contained certain obligations, such as the annual payment of treaty money to each band member. The chief and headman would receive a suit every 3 to 4 years, ammunition and twine, certain agricultural tools and domesticated animals, carpentry tools, the right to education, the right to pursue hunting, trapping, and fishing, promise to obey the law and observe the treaty and become good and loyal subjects of the Crown. These are only some of the provisions contained in the various numbered treaties. It should be noted that the treaties are complex legal documents that contain a technical language that is difficult to understand. Just imagine how difficult it would be to understand what the treaty was about in 1871 or 1910 because of the legal and technical phrases contained in the document if you are not familiar with English and with written language. When the original boundaries of Treaty No. 5 were agreed to in 1875, the process used was similar to the previous 4 treaties. The Crown designated representatives, who were referred to as treaty commissioners, to present the terms of the treaties to the First Nations. Because the treaty commissioners did not speak the First Nations languages, they used translators in an attempt to convey the terms of the treaty to the First Nations people. In most cases, the First Nations leadership did not understand the English language. Because of the language barrier, it is clear that 2 different understandings would emerge from the interpretation of the treaty. It is well known by First Nations people who are fluent in their own language that you cannot accurately translate a complex legal, technical English sentence into the First Nations language and have the same meaning. To illustrate this point, I would like you to consider the following text taken from Treaty No. 5. The said Indians do hereby cede, surrender, and yield up to the Dominion of Canada, for Her Majesty and her successors forever, all of their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to the lands. Just imagine how this legal meaning regarding the surrender of Aboriginal title can be translated into a First Nations language. As you can just imagine, it must have been very difficult for the First Nations people to accurately understand what the government's perspective was regarding the treaty. Because there are varying views of the treaties by First Nations and the federal government regarding the interpretation of the treaties, such as hunting and fishing rights, it is the courts that decide what those rights are within the law. Since there have been hundreds of court cases in the past to interpret the treaties, it is important to note a few legal principles that have emerged from these cases to form a foundation to guide the present court cases. Some of the notable principles are: treaties must be construed not according to the technical meaning of the words, but in the sense in which they would be naturally understood by Indians. It is important to consider the history and oral traditions of the Indians concerning the surrounding circumstances at the time the treaty was signed to determine the effect of the treaty. One of the most important decisions to date is the Supreme Court of Canada's ruling In Delgamuk, where Chief Justice Lamer affirmed the importance of considering the oral histories on equal footing with other types of historical evidence. The actual wording in the decision is described here. Notwithstanding the challenges created by the use of oral histories as proof of historical facts, the laws of evidence must be adapted in order that this type of evidence can be accommodated and placed on an equal footing with the types of historical evidence that courts are familiar with, which largely consists of historical documents. With this thought in mind, the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Centre has the privilege and honor to interview Elder Robinson Mcpherson from the Garden Hill First Nation for his wisdom regarding Treaty Number 5.
Kim sinoksen doamokin tiedessä, kun minä teetä, joku niin että mitä jää nuukun, ei näin, että kyllä.
Kagivin the most namna, nanda kinigi kok, nanda kohkom, nanda kumsum nanda kohkom, egomena nanda kchihak, vihati gunjo winda mohkwa, kegunen skonagan yustigan gatadik.
Konikaen kuti vilmaksin. Konikaen kuti vilmaksin. Kakutata en että individu maksunagan teniak, ei giinuntak.
Kegendanna, ugona ktsugmak taksnot magagimas not zana koma megat. 1919 gaina gendek. Akke. Kan sutstamagen ans niwizigizon.
Koino jotias. Se voitte konoka kaikki muunu kutukumaunegi muskaat. Ma kinsusta muu kono ans niwizigizon. Kaikki muunu kuat.
Stakana chingaya chansunnok. Ugikandana nagatnendan kegunen skonagan yustigan gaichagate kuma mega 19 gagendekakke.
Koino kutken sinna. Patsa buku eustraaten skonagan magaki kenomot. Katubakate we.
Anin he inendaman. Kagyun jamazno tuzats. Kamsomunanak. When skonagan yustigan. Anyon jigin nakuntamot.
Muzam megin miniyastamaguat. Ugmaunan eufamiguat. Kakanagun eustutamaguat miskimas nautuzok.
Nainano gamazagatek. Kikendana kegunen gagesatamagiat. Ugonak okamak. FP. Esatamaatan sunon. Umegat agamas negatek with treaty.
Niken se nunda mandabu. Yestamagun. Negoskauden. Kakana novada dinanigonan tzakshinesig. Igonastamagun.
Ego esanga sagagutsmugon. Kegunen kanihken. Kegunen kanihken intutsagon gahtutsatek megatsma. Esunya kaugizgak. Taskus kanatsunya jawi gagatu kapagan sunya kausunya. Kegunen kanihken maga intutsatek. Ego mana anen endaman. Inapat zanen matsunya kausunya.
Awezunya kakpagan nyanopke. Amerikanat tsgatek. Ugumau nevpamiat ansnon. Inukheb metrokhye. Nepia gomnan inukheb metrokh. Nukhen taug masks. Egomne inukheb muset kijigabism. Hamuafn wekhonat tsgatek. Evpamiat ugonan. Ekhnoatit hamsezunya mogeb mankhit murak.
Kakivin the most namna anes and staman. Weskonagan yustigan.
Ngaki vidansen ezinustaman skonagan yustigan. Taskutego kaknake gone enun desek ansno ne kegistuta utbanda. Ima skonaганик. Yekitmagzwat. Igagni kaknawe wakagandre. Kinda?
Hanin endaman huekaiskonagan yun.
Nimenomaan tässä neuvoskunnan juuriaan epämissä tapukumaan. Kontapskut hueskat emoja iskunnan juuriaan kihitmäärään naft. Eivät pakisakin utoven urtit jänsne mä fi iskunnan kaya pakikutapuk naft.
Kete puhtaan hue, kun ei hektu tamaat, kun on siihen, koska saaks kagamas nautsuats, pakitak saatamaan teine. Iskunnan union.
An snogna. Syötikin mä nautsuats, kun on snog. Mutta mekin minästä maatukumaa on ikuinen sanon, heipä mikut. Taskut menkese. Kai ehkä moneka meiji kanoin maatukulan ekaatini piunit, ekanandet isjääntukulan pikulan uteajismen. Amis muisti kaisasta maakin tukumaa on, hevistuu tuotan sanon, hekutuskoon nuovotasin muisti juet tutuutakutasta maakin.
Kitnen danna, ekon kehten dank, okamaun. Utas tamagon ang agis tamaten sunon.
Nahpetsou kstendan. Yön agis tamaten sunone. Egi minöndak ahkiniye mint. Kena? Ekon ahkiniye Yen egi mint ahkin. Miswen gaguti minöndak esu tamatugonon. Hukumaun nikonon anasunon. Nikos kaunga kena novatine.
Ukten danna kitnen ma. Okamaun nikonon tasnge konon agis tamagits. Utas tamagon ukten danna kitnen ma.
Kanin ukten danssana nukena. Ukten danssana nukena agis tamagits. Ekot kaunga kena sagas nesistumne nikonon utas tamagonen. Nahpetsansiki evinode koen utas tamagon. Atakas vega kidan. Peesigan sinne egi ammak kigati paunit sukupin egi amat. Kangat sukumaun egi gut kapamin egi gut.
Kispenge kon winda maata skihak. Skon ganis sigonanse. Kegonen gekno maatavan.
Joissa tekno maapanik hukumaun tastamaakin kevin aatikken tomaat kenop muuttuatuen hukumaun tastamaakin. Musven eilka kuikkuna muutavan ikuna kauskaatvat kenop muuttuatuen tikken tomaat. Mutta mä sen on ikkuat yön hukumaun tastamaakin kauskaatvat. Mutta kun muisakti mustemakkive hukumaun tastamaakin.
Wesa witsamugan konan mse ase kistokona ka witsamugan. Ego tassin kispena yawanen kekun. Ega agiun sa witsamugan. Ega gamas nagatek ma tsiki windaman kekun nagatean.
Distam sagaruna kangaruta. Datawat sagagyobatak. Ame egi minutes Egistä kun se hukumaun 1908. Amoin kaikki toivessa tomakit kiikunen. Sinällä. Ekua 1909 kisuniaka. Eko mä taas lopki minä pelkauja. Ase ihan teki 1908. Sinällä. Eko hukumaun kuveunu kiavastun. Egi jokon haatukolen ukumakanan. Mcpherson maati ei vihkaloin mat. Ego minä tehtäisiin ukiminaan ikolen ukumakanan. Meknoatiat apne ukumakanunt. Musta on kaikistuta. Naho ukumaan ei vihkaloin matan sun. Musta on kahtuta. Ego minä he uitjaat worden ook mag gaan. En ik ga goed op dat ze net weer niet genoeg had. He uitjaat. Ken je dat man? Napit se kiiminuendam ansnokumagaat ivenuutastamagunoa iguidamauta naatse kiiminuendamaat amiganatip maatisehkekikituat ukumaone famiguak amigagikituat egonukumgaisuavataman koonhyue udaksnatussin ukumaonutastamagivit